Welcome to the OnScript podcast, your home for world-class conversations on scripture and theology, where you get to meet some of the best in the field. Visit us at onscript.study. Say hello on Twitter at OnScriptPodcast and stop by our Facebook page at facebook.com/OnScript.
Hey everyone, welcome back to OnScript. This is Matt Lynch coming to you from Regent College in Vancouver. We're moving now into the middle to late spring, and nothing says springtime like a new episode. And for a lot of people, OnScript is a new podcast. Even though we're not a new podcast, we've been around about 9 years, that doesn't mean we're not new for someone else. So maybe you could share the word about OnScript with 3 to 10 people today for whom OnScript is not new. And then those people can experience this newness. And you who have been listening for a while and it's not new can remember vicariously through them what it's like to not have OnScript be not new. So enjoy the episode. Thanks so much for listening.
Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, OnScript fans. I am here today with Dr. Michelle Knight, who is an associate professor of Old Testament and Semitic languages at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School, otherwise known as TEDS. She has written many scholarly articles, and according to her CV, she seems to be on every board, committee, and subcommittee in academia. It looks like she's also got a few commentaries and textbooks launching in the coming years on Joshua, Judges, Ruth, and the so-called historical books of the Old Testament. But today, we are discussing her new book with Baylor University Press called The Prophet's Anthem, the Song of Deborah and Barak in the Narrative of Judges. Welcome to OnScript, Michelle.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here.
I am very excited to be here. We have had many conversations over the years, and I always think, we need to talk to Michelle. So now we have a book to talk about, to tear apart. I'm always interested. What got you on the road to scholarship and specifically scholarship in Judges? How did you land there?
I landed in Judges sort of secondarily. I am in academia primarily because I wanted to serve the pastorate, and I wanted to do that with academic rigor and close attention to biblical text. And so I went to seminary. I made sure I was running in pastoral circles. But I quickly realized I just adored language. And so when I took a Judges class with Lawson Younger back in the day, I took on the challenge of Judges 5 purely because I thought it was interesting in terms of Hebrew. I knew it would push my Hebrew knowledge. And I'm super interested in genre shifts. So I guess my interest in Judges was actually secondary to my interest in this poem that was really hard Hebrew that was stuck in a narrative. And so as I started working in that and worked through that Judges course and worked in Judges, I realized the book was such a prophetic call to so much of the way we think about the world today. I found it remarkably applicable to so many issues in the world. I mean, there's sexual violence, there's leaders covering things up, there's power struggles, there's a question about to what degree does military might cohere with God's view of the world. I mean, it's just these are all the same questions so many people are asking. So that's what drew me to Judges.
So way back in grad school, you were already zeroed in on Judges.
I was in.
All right.
Yeah, I've had a very everything lined up just right. And so I've been on this track for quite some time.
Okay. Well, I'm going to come back to that later in the speed round. So look out.
Oh, great.
In the Prophet's Anthem, you argue that the Song of Deborah is not just poetic flourish added into a story, but it's theological reflection nestled at the transitional core of the macro plot of Judges. Is that basically correct?
That's basically correct. Yeah, I would make a couple additional claims that are close implications of that, but that is the case. I think it actually has something to add to the way we read the plot, as opposed to sort of just a double of Judges 4. It actually changes the way we read a couple things. Yeah.
And to make a quick comparison, because I've always argued that in Exodus 15, for instance, you find out things that you simply can't see in the narrative, that God does all the, in the narrative, it's Moses doing all the actions. In Exodus 15, it's God doing.
Absolutely.
So I guess where would you see these? Do you see any twinning of that narrative poetic material here, or are these just two separate instances that happen to look alike?
No, there are a lot of resonances with Exodus 14, 15. And in fact, a lot of the poetry in narrative literature highlights the fact that there's actually common functions among a lot of these inset poems. And they tend to clarify theologically what's happening sort of implicitly in the narrative. It's done explicitly in the poem. One potential difference here is I would suggest, whereas in Exodus 15, it kind of shows us the realization that people are having I would suggest Exodus 15 is even more important in places like Joshua than it is in Exodus for its kind of after effects. I would suggest in Judges 5, it does the same thing, where it's the pairing, but also evaluates the response of the people, which is a kind of key thematic part in the book of Judges. How do the people respond to revelation? So it provides one of those revelatory opportunities.
Okay, that strikes up a lot of questions. So I'm going to go off my questions here because it seems that you have implications, and we've talked about this before, that poetry, after Romanticism, and even before that, poetry has this kind of place in culture that is basically fluffy, flourish, colorful. It's like the curtains that decorates the structure of the house, kind of thing. But what you're saying not only indicates what I think we all think correctly is that poetry is doing some vigorous arguing. But I have this other thought. What about theology today? Should poetry feature more strongly in our theologizing today, if that's how we are to, if it's the theological reflection on the text, what's changed?
I would suggest that poetry tends to use tools like imagery and rhetorical effect even more strongly than narratives do. Though obviously the average narrative is building in rhetorical effect. There's no question that's the case, but I do feel like the rhetoric is right on the surface in poetry to a certain extent. And I suppose the power of imagery to be affective in its orientation as well as kind of rational is a reminder to us that theology should also be fully orbed. It should involve imagery and a way of seeing the world. And it should have an affective element as well. So when I say affective, I don't mean superfluous and fluffy. I mean that the raw argument it's making, it also traces the way that affects us emotionally, and it does all that together. And I think theology should do that more often.
Amen. Okay, for those of us who are struggling to remember the story of Deborah and the Song of Deborah. I think most people remember the story with Yael, which we'll talk about a little bit later, but the song, maybe we struggle a little bit. So could you give us a quick thumbnail sketch of what you see going on in the song?
Totally. The song starts off with kind of a theophany, reminiscent of Sinai. It actually mentions Sinai. It talks about Yahweh striding forth from the south, which is where we would associate with Sinai. It's like military language. It's like he's marching forth. And so there's this mighty theophany right at the beginning. And Deborah's kind of like, all right, everybody listen up because God is on the move. And then immediately after that, she says, but by contrast, and she introduces the state of Israel at the time. And it's basically dilapidated. People are scared to be on, the roads, kind of like we see Gideon hiding in the cave doing his work. It's that same situation that she's describing. But then she says, now this changed after I became a prophet and I called Barak. We did see a little bit of a shift and the people started moving. That fear was removed. And so then she recounts by what process that took place. Then she'll describe, even though we had absolutely no fortifications, we had no weapons, the people came, they responded to the call to arms. What's fascinating is she doesn't say the people were glorious in battle. She says the people showed up. And she declares this to a bunch of people riding around on donkeys. And we're like, what does that have to do with anything? But she's like, hey, remember when I told you the roads were abandoned, nobody was moving? Well, now bustling commerce is taking place. So all of you who are experiencing that turnabout, let's remember why. And so she reminds them all these people showed up to battle. Some people didn't. And she kind of highlights that. And she even outright censures one settlement, Meroz, that didn't come to battle. And she interprets not coming to battle as not helping Yahweh. And this is kind of a central theme in the song, is that Yahweh is doing battle and your job is to show up and follow. She doesn't think that they're going to do much. In fact, it's the stars from their courses, the kind of heavenly bodies that are actually winning the battle, or the Kishon. It's not the people, it's God, through kind of the cosmos altering features that serve him. But then, interestingly, after we have all of this battle and we assume the climax of the battle will be there, the climax of the battle actually transpires in Jael's tent. And so we have these two vignettes right at the end. One in Jael's tent that talks about her subduing Sisera. It emphasizes the fact that she is tent dwelling to show that she's not like heavily fortified. She's not part of the settled, Israel, though Israel's only partially settled at this point. But she's on the move. She's semi-nomadic. She's not part of Israel, emphasizes that, and shows that she subdued Sisera. And that's paired with a vignette of Sisera's household, where they are expecting him to actually subdue women, very much like Jael. And they are sitting kind of whining about how his chariots haven't returned yet. And we are left as people to be like, wow, this unfolded entirely differently than how society expected it to. And at the last minute, Deborah says, so in this may those who love Yahweh go forth in all of his might.
Yeah, I love reading this poem out loud in class. And I've done it dozens of times, and I never noticed what you pointed out, which is, it's funny, like when you pointed out, it's so obvious that his mom, who you initially feel a little sorry for, you're like, oh, even he's got a mother, too. And then she's like, shouldn't they be done raping by now? And, and stealing all the stuff. And you're like, oh, well, maybe not. And that Yael, that she would have been a natural target of that sexual assault as well. Never put that together in my mind.
Right?
Yeah. So thank you you connected a million dots in my mind in this book. So that was very good for me as somebody who I thought I understood this book, and then you read someone who's really spent some time in it, you're like, oh yeah, okay. There's a lot more going on here. Okay. So now why, you argue in long form this, but why just very quickly do you think this is not just a prophetic utterance slapped onto a story?
There are two or three things that I'll highlight. Short form. One reason I would suggest it's a little bit different is that divine speeches have a lot of prominence in the Book of Judges, and generally big things happen. Speeches tend to kind of introduce a new movement in the way that God's responding to the people. So I think that kind of structural feature says, oh, well, this isn't technically Yahweh speaking, but it's his messenger, just like we have the Malach Adonai earlier in the book, the angel or the messenger of Yahweh. And so the fact that she's a prophet speaking on his behalf should remind us of that. Another feature is that the cycle ends not before the song, but after the song. And that doesn't mean a ton, but the cyclical markers in the Book of Judges are super intentional and kind of help us make sense of how the plot is progressing. So for that to be after, I think is worth considering.
In the sense that some editor or narrator clearly thinks that this is part of the cycle.
I guess that's what I'm saying,
Yeah.
yes. I mean, I'm not sure that changes it. If we just thought this was slapped on for reflective purposes, it would probably also be the same. But also, there are a lot of resonances with the Gideon story that are otherwise unnecessary. So, for example, there's kind of this odd introduction of Deborah as an Ish Naviah, or an Isha Naviah, a woman prophet. We have the same introduction of a male prophet in chapter 6 as an Ish Navi, which is just never said. We as interpreters argue in Judges 4, like, oh, is this a way to highlight that she's a woman? And I was like, well, if that's the case, it's weird that we're calling him an Ish Navi in chapter 6, because we would have probably assumed he was masculine. And that seems to be the author's way of tying these characters together, and in some way saying, hey, this is a second person asking you to reflect on what God has done. And then for it to have all this Exodus-like imagery, and then for Gideon to be like, God hasn't really done anything for us since the Exodus. We're just like, did you just hear? And even if geographically or temporally they weren't aligned in history, the way the Book of Judges puts them together invites us to hear his story after her proclamation. And I think that highlights the way that in the book, it functions to say, if you had any doubt about what I was doing, I sent a prophet to explain it to you. So if this is a generation that does not know Yahweh, as the introduction says, and doesn't know what he's done for Israel, he sent a prophet to explain what he continues to do for Israel.
Yeah, and could you explain also, because you brought this up, and I had a separate question about this Isha Navia versus her being called an Eshet Lapidot, right? So you say this bolsters, so just connect the dots on why, go back to the Ish Navi. The only reason they're calling him an Ish Navi, your point is because they're reflecting on the fact that they called her a Isha Navia, right?
That's what I would suggest. The more frequently in the Hebrew Bible, we call a prophet Navi or Navia. Obviously, the gendered term is super rare. Well, actually, we don't have Isha and Navia anywhere else. But we do have gendered terms like that, like a nurse is an Isha Nakva. And so we have other gendered terms that are explicit like that.
We do that today. My son is thinking about going to nursing school, and I was like, "Oh, get ready! Everybody's going to call you a male nurse."
Yeah, exactly. So I guess what I'm saying is, whatever that's doing thematically, the title of the male prophet shows that those two stories are being held together, and there are some other features that held them together, but that in particular, I think.
Excellent. Okay, so I'm going to throw some of my ideas past you on the Book of Judges, and you're going to shoot them down. You are Iron Dome at this point.
I can't wait.
So you don't talk much in the book because it's not your task, so this is no fault of the book, but you don't talk much about kind of this more type of person in the Hebrew Bible, like where Yael she's the surprising outsider character.
Yeah.
So I'm going to throw some other surprising outsider characters, and you tell me if you think there's an actual connection here. So obviously the midwives of Exodus, depending on whether you take them to be Hebrew or Egyptian midwives, because it's unclear which they are there. Pharaoh's daughter, surprising outsider, rescuing. Zipporah, which with her emergency circumcision rescue, did not see that coming. Rahab, and then you could maybe even make a case here of Ruth. You maybe even make a case of Tamar with Judah as a surprising outsider. Do you see Yael as one in a line with them, or this is kind of a unique circumstance, a unique role she's playing?
No, I think there's a consistent thematic. There's a consistent theme in the Hebrew Bible of showing that not only can Yahweh use those who are assumed to be weak societally, but he actually prefers to. And I mean, places like Hannah's song really exemplifies the reversal that he likes to bring. And it seems that this is a mode of revelation that's particularly effective. And so Yahweh uses it a lot. So I would suggest this is yet one more time in the history of Israel where he's like, just in case you thought that your own strength saved you, let me choose whom you consider to be the least central to my redemptive work, and I'm going to use them to do it. So I would align her with that standard theological tendency.
Okay, so now here's the harder question.
I'm ready.
Where we just have to speculate. Why is it usually women?
I mean, it depends on whether you think Carol Myers is right or not.
I usually do.
I think that, yeah, I know you do. I mean, there's always a question of how misogynistic and or patriarchal ancient Israel was on the ground. I think there's at minimum reason to see that leaders tended to be male, whether that is a sign of patriarchy or not. And so I do think there is a sense in which, especially in the military stories, so this wouldn't reflect the midwives situation, but especially in military stories where women are not part of the draft, if you want to call it that, they're not part of the muster. Their being part of any military situation is a shock. And so I think, at least in military context, that surprises me. And I think it would have surprised them as well, though female prophets are not that strange in the ancient Near East at all. But like Abigail in the same way, Abigail having a kind of prophetic thing to say isn't crazy, but in the middle of a couple almost battle narratives, her presence and her effectiveness is surprising. So I think that element of women explicitly in the Hebrew Bible being separated from military endeavors gives us warrant to see that part as a surprise. But then outside of that, we have to be far more speculative about the role of women and their perceived respectability
Yeah, I want to drill down on that because you very consistently portray Yael as being a non-combatant. You lay out the kind of the different binaries you could think with male and female here, and non-combatant is the one you land on, and specifically that her defeating Sisera wouldn't have necessarily been shaming to Barak in any way, even if there might have been something like some personal, some kind of personal failure associated with it. So I guess lay out for people, because I thought this is a particularly interesting argument that you're making here. Because she's a non-combatant, this is surprising. I guess, why don't you see shame also playing in there, that this would have been fundamentally shaming for Barak?
Whether or not I was nuanced enough in the book, I don't know, because I want to leave room that, like, he would have experienced some shame, but I'm trying to say, what do I think the textual accent is? I guess what I'm saying is, within the narrative, we see a very clear shaming of Sisera. Sisera moves from being somebody on a chariot to someone on foot to someone seeking the help of an ally, and then being embarrassed and deceived in that context. And again, ultimately killed by a non-combatant with not a weapon. And so we see him kind of very clearly shamed. So there's that. First of all, we don't see that with Barak, at least explicitly. It doesn't mean there isn't some room to go there. And a lot of a lot of popular interpretations see an implicit shame. But he perceives what's happened in the same way that, like, in the Ehud story, the two servants perceive what happens. We don't usually say that they're ashamed. We say they're surprised. And I think he's surprised too. But maybe the most important thing for me is, because I'm reading Judges 5 as a prophetic interpretation of the battle, where Deborah is evaluating all of the different characters, she never gives Barak a hard time. And it seems so strange to me that if this is a song evaluating all the folks that are involved, she doesn't give Barak a hard time. I want to be careful about reading that into it. So I'm letting the song drive my interpretation a little bit. I think the narrative also leads me there, but the song kind of keeps me from reading an implicit shame where there isn't an explicit one. One more thing I'll say. We often get to shame because the word said, you won't experience honor for this battle. We often assume that's the word that exists in the honor-shame binary, but it is not the word in Hebrew that exists in the honor-shame binary. And so I think the other reason we sometimes get there is because we're assuming that word means if you aren't honored, you are therefore shamed. But this word just means credit. You're not going to get the credit for this victory, someone else will. So would that come with it a secondary shame? Maybe. But that doesn't seem to be what the text is pushing, I would say.
Yeah, no, I think that's very helpful. And, let's just face it, Deborah is not afraid to call names and, call out people by name, like, hey, you did not show up, right?
Yeah, arguably that is the purpose of the song. I mean, there are some people that said that's the only purpose of the song. And then she says nothing bad about Barak, ever.
That's good. Okay, so I did want to put in one story that I think you mentioned in passing somewhere, but I think it deals with this issue. So Abimelech, when he dies under his own he gets wounded under his own folly, and then he has somebody run him through the sword. He specifically says, "Lest they say of me, a woman has killed him."
Exactly. Yes. So this would be, I think, the strongest textual evidence for that being a shameful way to die. But even in that situation, I think the reason it would be shameful for a woman to kill him is because she's not even on the battlefield. So I still think the shame is tied to the woman being not part of the battle, as opposed to just like women shame men. So I still want us to fill out woman with more of a connotation than just being biologically female.
In other words, it could have been like some random old man threw a millstone off the tower, right?
Right. I think I would assume, or a child, I would assume the same thing in that situation. I do think that women are more thematically vulnerable in the book of Judges. And so that contributes to a particular marginalization in society in the book of Judges that makes that more prime category. But yeah.
Yeah, and I think you actually get more emphasis on it too if you see Saul's death account as a parallel to Abimelech.
That's right.
It's just a random archer who just drew a bow at random, which I think is a horrible translation of that. But it's just but it's a warrior, and it's just an unexpected. Yeah. Okay, I got another idea I want to throw past you. So whenever I read through this passage, I always think, because I do remember when I became a Christian and read Scripture for the first time when I was 20, there are certain passages where I like, oh, that really surprised me. I remember being surprised. And one of them was when she says, God's going to give this, the road you're going down is not going to lead to where you're headed, but he's going to give it in the hand of a woman. I straight up thought it was Deborah was the woman, the woman she was referring to.
I know, right?
So there's like this double surprise. You get over it and it's like, oh, and also you get this interpretative rando sentence, and the Kenites pitch their tents as far as Ananim or whatever,
right.
And you're like, what is going on here? It's a very, oddly constructed narrative in some ways, in that all the parts are coming together. It's almost like, I don't know if you ever watched Better Call Saul, but the television show where you're just like, what is he doing? He's just pulling these different elements together, and then all of a sudden you have the moment where you're like, oh, that's brilliant.
Yeah.
Okay, good. So you buy that argument then. Okay. So now, how does this narrative poetry unit? Do you have a name for that? The conjoined twins here. How does that basically function within the macro narrative of Judges? And maybe we should start by saying, how do you divide up the big narrative of Judges?
I mean, I use the same divisions as most people. That's not true. Let me split it up a little bit. Probably the piece we all agree upon is that the first couple chapters go together, the last 5 chapters go together, and then all the middle ones go together. I think pretty much all of us agree on that. I would put a couple divisions in that middle part. Some interpreters push this, but I think to some degree it's more just like a lay understanding of interpreters. But there is this kind of conception that there's this smooth and steady decline in this middle part of the book where every judge is a little bit worse than the one before them. And some people have written on this like really well, so I'll let them address it. Brandon Hurlburt being one of those people. But I would suggest there's also kind of a division between 5 and 6, and then a little bit later in chapter 10. So within the macro plot, we basically have this introduction where we hear about the generation after Joshua. We hear that Judah was largely faithful with some backdrop, and importantly, it was the chariots of iron that kept them from doing what they were supposed to do.
Where it also drops a line in there about the Kenites.
That's right.
It starts foreshadowing these Kenites out there.
That's right.
Yeah.
And I think Greg Wong is one of the people that argues that's one of many links between the song and the surrounding narrative that shows like it's really integrally attached to a lot of the things going on here, though that's obviously in the narrative too. We have this whole generation that doesn't know Yahweh. After that initial generation and their issues, we see that they are progressively living more and more embedded in Canaanite society. That's how I would talk about chapter 1. Chapter 2 says, here then is what happens because of that. These people just don't know God. They don't know him. They don't know what he's done. And so there's this general pattern in the period where, God's going to raise up a savior. They're going to reject him, yada, yada, yada. And ultimately, God's going to use these battles kind of in 2 ways. He's going to use them to test, by which we mean to determine, to show them whether or not they're going to be faithful to Yahweh's directives. And at the same time, teach them something about Yahweh. That's my argument. A lot of us talk about those dual purposes in various ways, but there's some kind of dual function to these. I would just call them revelatory because they reveal both people's inclinations and Yahweh's action. So they're just revelatory experiences. Every battle teaches them something. And so then each of these battles are an opportunity to see how people respond to Yahweh's salvation.
And it goes thusly. With this, I think your book is therefore arguing with a major turn at the end of chapter 5, at the end of the Song of Deborah.
And I would say basically the first 3 cycles, we see the judges themselves the judges and the saviors. I think sometimes we make that one whole category, and I think Judges 4 pushes us to reevaluate those categories. But the people involved in saving, we don't know as much about them as we would expect. It's not really until chapter 6 onward, and other people have developed this, and I'm drawing on their work. But it's not until chapter 6 onward where we actually get a lot of insight into these individual characters. Like Gideon is a super full-fledged character. Even Jephthah, we know a lot about his motivations and the way he thinks. And obviously that's true of Samson too. But before that, we don't know much about them. The emphasis seems to be narratively on the fact that God uses people, surprising people, in fact, to prove to everybody that he can reverse their fortunes, that he can change how they're experiencing things on the ground. Judges 5 lays this out, and it's like, look how mighty God is. No matter how weak you thought you were, God can do amazing things in you. And then from Gideon onward, we start to actually watch how then do the people respond, not only to that pattern that started in the period, but to this significant revelatory experience. How then do they respond? And from Gideon's kind of a transitional figure where there's even more revelation in his lifetime. Like he's got an angel walking with him or a messenger walking with him, showing him things, God's speaking directly to him. He's getting dreams, like tons of revelation. And yet at the end of his cycle, he's providing something everybody's going to worship. He's providing a false idol. And so the kind of institutional rebellion against Yahweh just kind of skyrockets at that point, and that's sort of the downhill side. So I would suggest there's kind of a cliff after Gideon as opposed to a slow, steady decline, because I just don't know how much we're evaluating the judges themselves, the saviors themselves in those first 3 cycles. We just don't have enough information to.
Yeah, they're kind of like Noah characters. Or Noah before the flood. He's like,
yes, they're there.
Yes, Lord, whatever.
Yeah. And of course, we do have the start of hesitancy with Barak. Like, he obviously is corrected. So we start to evaluate Barak, but he's praised in the song. In the aggregate, things went well. And then Gideon's where we start to think, what's actually going on in their brains that's making this so hard? And that's what the back half, I would suggest, really focuses on.
Yeah, and with Gideon, you get all kinds of what's going on in your brain too, because it's like, you rule us, you and your sons after us. He's like, no, I will not rule you. God is your king. And you're like, yes. Yeah. And then you're like, his son's name is my father, the king.
That's right. That's right.
Like, what?
Well, and we see the people say for Yahweh and for Gideon, and just small shifts. Even Jotham in his fable is more worried that the people didn't honor Gideon than he is that they didn't honor Yahweh. And so there is a degradation that kind of comes to fruition in that last part of the book.
It's almost like it's brilliant literature.
It's almost like somebody really intentionally put all this together.
Somebody really smart.
These guys
knew what they were doing here.
Well, we have for decades. I mean, I guess Brevard Childs popularized it. I think other people had noticed before him, but he popularized the idea that like the Song of Hannah lays open the kind of thematic framework for all of Samuel. And we've all agreed on that forever. But it's like, I'm kind of like, well, why aren't we assuming the same thing in some of these other books?
And Deborah's song and the whole story has lots of it vibes. I'm trying to avoid that phrase. It rhymes thematically very strongly with what Hannah is arguing.
Yes, it does.
And mutually rhymes with what Joshua is arguing. Everywhere the sole of your foot treads, right? Yeah. So
that's exactly right. It's exactly right. It brings us back to the standard kind of theological push of a lot of the former prophets. They're all pushing the people toward the same theological revelation, kind of one after the other.
Okay, so thinking of Judges as a kind of pedagogical piece of literature, it makes sense to me, and I'm doing another running one of my ideas past you.
Can't wait.
It does make sense to me, just as a pedagogue, somebody who teaches for a living, that you get this abstract cycle of sin, as we call it, that they apostatize, God hands them over, sells them into the hand of their oppressors, they oppress, they cry, they raise up a judge. Okay, so you get an abstract version of that. Do you know anywhere in the ancient Near East where you get an abstract version of a story and then you see that story played out in cycle after that?
I'm trying to think.
Kind of
I'm
like a
not
narrator
sure.
going like, here's what you're getting, like the beginning of Twilight Zone,
I know. I'm trying to think in the Bayle epics if we get that at all, because that's the kind of place I'd expect it.
Right.
But off the top of my head,
it might be literally unique in the ancient Near East.
to have a cycle.
To have an abstract cycle that you see then. And I say that because then the very next instance is the shortest, most economic version of that cycle with the historical details plugged in. It's kind of like learning how to do a math problem, and then the next problem is like you get whole numbers in there or whatever. In there.
Yeah.
So like this is what it looks like in the cleanest form. And then here's another iteration with a lot more details and a little bit of something, something new going on. Here's more. And then after chapter 6, it's the center cannot hold. You're not even sure where you are on the map anymore, as you point out in the book. Yeah.
It's falling apart. Yeah.
Okay. Good. So that's helpful that I haven't completely misconstrued that. And then you also compare in these kind of cycles, kind of pre and post, Yael and Ehud, which I had not thought about that comparison before. So why do you compare those two people? And besides the obvious that they're assassins, right? But beyond that, what do we get from those two?
Well, we have some really specific lexical parallels about like when she grabs the tent peg and the action she does. Being some with a thrust is the same verb, and then the way that the corpse falls on the ground is similarly laid out. And then this type scene in that then we have somebody come in and observe that. That is a very strong lexical parallel. And I'm not the first one to note that. Others have highlighted that. But observing those lexical parallels allows us to realize that she's probably the savior in the cycle. That she's, and there are other hints in the song and other places, but she's the one that's actually effecting the victory over the oppressor in the narrative.
Yeah, I should also take a moment to point out that you have your own translation of the entire song in here that started out, which was very nice, very appreciative.
Okay.
A note to Baylor University Press. Even with glasses, I struggled to read the Hebrew font.
It was quite small.
Dave, I'm not coming after your whole life, but Dave, you need a senior citizens version of that. Or maybe I'm just.
Let's also shout out to Baylor because they were like, "We love your book," and then I feel like for the copy editor, there was like, "Oh, there's so much Hebrew here." Like I just want to give them a hug and be like, "I'm so sorry."
No, it was great, but I did struggle. I was like, forget. I'm not even going to pay attention to what vowels are on here.
I'll admit that.
Yeah. Okay. Excellent. All right. Are you ready for a speed round?
I am, but can I give a disclaimer?
Yes.
Like I've been sick, so I don't want any listener to be like, this is an accurate measure of her cleverness. Does that make sense?
I don't.
So like, I just want a disclaimer
I don't think
that
sick gets you out of that.
No, I'm sure it does. So I just want like a general, like my brain isn't as functional. So don't think that Drew was more clever than you. If I don't.
No, there's not a day in which I'm more clever than you, but,
okay, fair.
Okay. So here we go. Since you're such a judge's junkie, I am really interested to know what kinds of TV shows and movies do you watch? I'm assuming they're going to be really dark.
You'd think, but I think because I'm a judge's person, I avoid it. So I love fantasy and sci-fi.
Oh, okay.
Love it. Because I'm like, I live in real awful stuff all day long in my scholarship. So I want none of it.
So what would be a top show or movie for you?
Listen, Drew, I don't like to say this out loud because people get a little judgy.
Okay, well then just between us then.
I really like Star Trek.
Which you gotta like, there's a universe. All of it?
There's probably not an episode I haven't seen multiple times.
Wow. Okay.
Don't call me a Trekkie.
No. Full disclosure, I watched all the Next Generation after making fun of my father for watching this show for a long time. Then I started watching and I got completely hooked on the Next Generation. Back in the 90s when it was still on TV. Yeah. And my granddaughter is named after a Star Trek character.
No way.
Yoda, yeah. Which apparently is Uhura's first name. So I'm now like embedded in the Star Trek universe.
I appreciate that.
Okay. Now hang tight with this question. If you were having a Judges 4 and 5 themed party... So get your head around that one first.
Sure. I've had one.
Well, okay. What food and drinks would you serve?
I feel like the drink would need to be like a Bloody Mary. for obvious reasons. Unless the Baptists were there, in which case we'd have to make adjustments. Food.
I felt like
We
this
could have also
I felt like this is really
yogurt.
low hanging. I was going to say
We could have done
curds
yogurt
and
or
whey.
curdles. Yeah, so kind of yogurty, gross. Yeah, yogurt and Bloody Marys, I think we'd have to do. Honestly, I don't know how else we could do that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Bloody Mary. This sounds like a party we all want to go to. Bloody Marys with curdled
so good.
yogurt. I think it's called cottage cheese. Okay. Easier question then. What's the most significant book in biblical studies in the last 50 years for you?
Oh.
So that's since 1974.
Okay. I mean, I'm a narrative critic. So like Alter's works, even though I now will pick at them, I think were kind of watershed for me and for a lot of others. And being like literary artistry maybe is a really big deal. So given my proclivities, I would say something like that.
Yeah, I like that. I also love it and find myself now picking at them, but still love them.
Yeah. Yeah.
I love the feels. Okay. I warned you we're going to play this game, so you can't blame sickness for this.
Son of a- yeah, I know. I'll do my
Second
best.
ever host interviewee competition. Who can name the most songs about strong women? Okay, I'll go first, if that's okay with you.
Okay.
I hope I'm stealing one of them from you. I am woman, hear me roar.
Superwoman, Alicia Keys.
Is that a real song? Are you making things up? Is Alicia Keys even a performer?
Of the two of us, who do you think is going to listen to the more like female empowerment songs?
Actually, I don't know. I may have.
Let's see how many more you got, Drew.
We'll
I'm
see. Run the World, girls do, Beyonce.
ready. Man, that's one of my favorites.
Okay.
One Girl Revolution,
By
super chick. Because I am a child of the 90s and I listened to bad girl bands along with the good ones.
I mean,
so just like roll with
we're not going to judge people's 80s and 90s musical taste here.
Thank you. We all did our best.
Yeah. Roar, Katy Perry.
Yeah. Respect, Aretha Franklin.
Dang it. I should have known anyway. Fight Song, Rachel Platten.
Also an excellent one. I'm going to go with T Swift All Too Well 10-minute version.
Did I have the 10-minute version? Oh, no.
The regular one isn't as female powered.
And I reluctantly admit I've heard that 10-minute version more times than I'd like to admit. Okay. Stronger, What Doesn't Kill You, Kelly Clarkson.
Yeah. Well, then I'll go Stronger, Britney Spears.
Another Aretha Franklin one, Think, from the Blues Brothers.
That's really good. I'm Coming Out. I'm coming out.
Who is that?
I don't know. It's some
Jackson-
70s ballad.
Is it
I got
not
nothing.
Jackson 5? I just saw a dancer
it's
that
not Jackson
performed to
5.
that.
It's not Jackson.
So I know the song.
Actually,
Okay.
it's a woman. But yeah.
Well, it's hard to tell with Jackson 5, you know.
Boo.
He's got a very high
Go,
voice.
Drew. Get out of here, man.
Okay, this is a deadly one, 9 to 5, Dolly Parton.
Excellent choice. Shake It Off, T Swift.
Are we going to count that as a strong?
100%. I was thinking about this. I was like, Drew's going to challenge some of these, but I feel like I have some like feminist imperative where I can be like, Drew, you want to tell me that's not a power woman song? You know what I mean?
Look, I may have listened to more Taylor Swift than you. Like it is actually fully possible that I've spent more.
Really?
Oh yeah.
Is it your family?
Yeah.
Or is it
not,
you?
No, not me. I would never. But
I wasn't sure.
yeah, no. Time in a minivan where I have never had control of the radio ever. And so, okay.
Oh, that's funny.
My next one is ironically, Proud Mary by Ike and Tina Turner. If you know that whole backstory.
Okay, yes, that is, I thought about it and then I was like, I don't know if this actually counts, but I'll take it as that. All About That Bass.
Okay, that's a good one. Okay,
empowerment.
one with a similar feel to it, About Damn Time by Lizzo.
Yeah, that's right. What's it called? Independent, I think. Independent Women by Destiny's Child.
Okay, I don't know that one. I totally believe it. My Taylor Swift reach was The Man.
The Man is on. Yeah, that's on my mental list as well.
Okay.
That's not a reach at all.
Okay.
Karma is also probably.
I don't know
Karma.
that one. Or I might, but I don't know the names of songs very well.
It's one of her grittier ones, but yeah. Your turn.
Oh, my turn?
Are you running out? Are you?
No. I've got one. I've got one, and it's one that I both love musically, and the lyrics are very strong. "You Don't Own Me" from the 1960s.
Oh, solid choice.
Yeah.
We already did "Run the World," right?
Yep.
I feel like there's more from Beyonce. Single ladies, right?
If you like it, then you better put a ring on it.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of like
I need
it's
a
stretch.
man
It's a
like.
stretch. I don't need a man.
I wish I were videotaping.
It's a stretch. It's a stretch. Girl on fire. Girl on fire.
Okay. Yeah.
Yes.
Actually.
Fire. Alicia Keys again.
Yeah, that's a good one. Okay, I'm gonna give you my final one because I think I probably could think of more, but I'm bad at making lists. These Boots Are Made for Walking by Nancy Sinatra edition.
Solid choice.
Yeah.
Solid choice. Have we done "I Will Survive" yet?
No, but you would win with that song.
Yes.
All right. That was a good round, man. We killed like 5 minutes of that, and I'm sure listeners were screaming songs into their car speakers, going like, "Why aren't they mentioning X, Y, or Z?" So we'll see.
Yeah, I like that you assume they were that interested.
They are. Okay.
I hope so. I hope so.
Another standard easy question: what idea in biblical studies needs to be given concrete shoes and thrown into Lake Michigan?
That everybody is as obsessed with David as everybody thinks they are. It's like everything's about legitimizing David. I'm over it.
Wait, you're in a different universe than I am now. You mean legitimizing David as a character in the storyline?
Judges is all about legitimizing David.
Yeah.
Ruth is all about legitimizing David.
Yeah.
It's like nothing can be in there unless it's about the fight between the North and the South and proving that David is the supreme ruler. I have no doubt that has some effect on these things. I have no doubt that that's in there. But I'm not as obsessed with David as the average interpreter is. I just feel like there's a lot of other characters to focus on. Making the book of Ruth all about David makes me really angry.
Yeah, no, that completely makes sense.
For example.
And then First Kings
and Judges.
1 would be more of a takedown piece on David.
That's what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
I feel like we all just need to calm down about David.
Calm down about David.
Yeah.
It'll be the next song that somebody writes. Okay. Have you ever seen the animated movie A Bug's Life?
I have.
Okay. Do you think the writer should be sued by the author of Judges for plagiarism? Do you know of what I speak?
No idea what you're saying. What are you talking about? What's happening?
A story
I've
where
not watched it in a minute.
People spend all year growing food and storing it up, and then these outsiders descend on them like locusts, and they run and hide in their caves. Yeah.
Okay. To be fair, if anything, that is a standard plot of agrarian life.
That's
and
true.
Judges
That is true.
Is riffing on it.
Yeah, that's
to be fair.
Like even in television lore, this is a standard plot. Okay.
Yeah.
Have you set up any meetings yet with Gideon's International to let them know that you've discovered some unsavory facts about Gideon?
I haven't yet, though. That's on my to-do list. I have several on my to-do list. I also have a friend named Samson, and I'm always just like, that was an unfortunate choice.
Oh, I mean, we have close family friends who name their kid Jonah, and I was like, really? Of all the prophets, that's the one?
Yeah. Luckily, nobody's walking around named Jephthah, but otherwise I
mean, my son's name is Benjamin, so what are you going to do?
What are you going to do?
Especially in a book of Judges, Benjamin is, Okay, last speed round question. In all the interviews you've done on the book of Judges, because it's your space, right? All the interviews, what's like the best question you've ever been asked?
This doesn't feel like a speed round question. This is reflective.
Yeah. Maybe surprisingly insightful, something like that.
Yeah, I've got nothing, man. I love it when people ask what got me into it. So I know that that's a standard question, but I think all of us are in biblical studies for like very concrete reasons. And it says a lot about us. And I think it's good for all of us to remember that none of our interpretation is like disconnected from our passions and our desires. And there's so much about my interpretation that like I'm pretty sure it's textually driven, but it is so good for students to be like, here are all the things we know about Dr. Knight. I can see how that might influence her interpretation. And I think that just makes us really keen and humble interpreters to remember that we're not disinterested. And so I wish I could walk into a room and be like, hey, I'm doing my best to read scripture, but here are all of my biases. And so I love when people ask that question, not just for interest, but like just so when you read my work, you know what I might be watching for, and you can kind of filter that into your interpretation of my work. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I mean, my man, Michael Polanyi up here, who I have a bumper sticker in my background here, he's a scientist turned philosopher who just says he turns bias the other way around. He says bias means that you can see significance where others can't.
And I constantly tell my student that's some of the real strength of our kind of turn in research toward analyzing social location is we're recognizing that like certain people see things that nobody else would see just because of their story and who they are. And that's actually a benefit.
That's not a bad thing.
It's great.
Okay. Back to the interview. I have one last question here, or one last series. Okay, I'm going to read a quote from you. This is a very quotable book, but on page 141, you say, quote, "To describe these leaders, these judges, as those made strong out of weakness is the simplest and most appropriate characterization of the judges one could offer. With clarity and uniformity, the central section of Judges has emphasized the weakness of its titular characters in construing the history of the pre-monarchic period with one overriding purpose, to indict the people of Israel." Okay, so now given this summary of where you situate Judges, should we be reading Judges as kind of a paired text with Samuel's, like we might read Ezra, Nehemiah, or Luke, Acts? Because I feel like a lot of the things you're saying about Judges, I can think immediately of like a parallel text in Samuel's that are.
In Samuel.
Yeah.
I think Samuel and Judges are playing off of each other very closely. Even things like Saul looking like several of the judges and things like that. So I absolutely would read those two together. I would also say that Kings sounds a lot like Judges. The kind of cyclical element we talked about, we can talk about a cycle in Kings in exactly the same way. And arguably, it's doing something similar in a different era of Israelite history. So I often push my students to read Joshua and Samuel, or Judges and Samuel together. But Judges is also really tied closely to Joshua. And so I wouldn't want to bracket it off with Samuel because then we'd lose that clear Joshua connection, which is like even more textually explicit than the Samuel connection.
Yeah, it's like these are all sequentially metastasized into each other, you know.
It's almost like, yeah. But I do think Judges is laying a lot of the theological groundwork upon which Samuel then, a certain read of Samuel, is building.
You know, in the looking at those cycles in the issue of cycles, I'm glad you said that about Kings as well, because I would not have thought of it that way, but it seems obvious again now that you mention it. It reminds me of Genesis 1 in this one weird way, which is that, you know, Genesis 1 it's a cycle of days. And there's formulaic expressions. There was evening, there's
That's
morning.
right.
On that day, he saw
right.
that it was good. But I mapped it out once for a book I was working on. Not a single day is identical to the other day. So all of those formulaic expressions are repeated, but there's not a singular identical one. So each day is actually literarily unique in the way that it's described.
Yeah.
And I feel like there's something like that going on with the cycles of Judges as well. Like they're kind of they're shadowing off the cycle, but none of them are identical to it. What I came up with a term for this question: cyclical asymmetrical plotting. That was my. Is this a thing?
I think Hebrew narrative uses repetition with some frequency. So we've been calling them cycles. I mean, narrative paneling would be another way we could talk about like what we see in the back half of Genesis, where we see narratives that are repeated,
right.
Almost like type scenes.
Like
so we also talk about type scenes.
Yeah.
So there's all sorts of very common repetition, but breaks from repetition. And the way I read Judges 5, for example, there are 2 or 3 places that most English translations and most contemporary interpreters, usually non-Jewish interpreters, read them as strict repetitions, where I read them as repetitions with a little bit of change. And Jack Sasson is the one who emboldened me to do that. And I noticed other Jewish interpreters tend to do it that way because they're reading the Masoretic text more closely. But I think when we see repetition, we're assuming blatant repetition because we aren't as used to that narrative strategy. But almost always it's not rote repetition. It's almost always developmental, just like parallelism.
Developmental repetition.
Developmental.
Yeah.
Even parallelism is that. And so I think we are just expecting repetition to be different because we don't use it in the same way.
Yeah, a cultural expectation of rote, but it's all developmental. That's great. Well, Michelle, thank you very much for this book, which is titled The Prophet's Anthem, The Song of Deborah and Barak, in the Narrative of Judges with Baylor University Press. Thank you for your wisdom.
Happy to share it. I'm so glad it was helpful.
You've been listening to OnScript, delectable conversations on scripture and theology. If this episode has brought you inner peace or lit your biblical fire, please consider a small donation of just $2 or $5 per month. Information on how to donate can be found at onscript.study/donate.